The gods of Lordran fell, and when they did, the golden city of Anor Londo was left with only one ruler still standing. His name was Gwyndolin, the Dark Sun. He was the last remaining deity of Gwyn's bloodline to stay in the capital, and after everything collapsed around him, he made a decision that would change the future of this legendary city forever. For centuries, Anor Londo had been closed off to the outside world. The great capital of the gods was a place ordinary beings could never reach. But Gwyndolin looked at what remained of his father's kingdom and understood something had to change. The city was decaying. It was partly ruined. Some accounts even suggest it had been physically displaced from its original location during the chaos of the ages. If Anor Londo was going to survive, it needed help. So Gwyndolin opened the gates. Undead heroes from distant places like the Undead Burg were suddenly welcomed into the legendary capital. This was an enormous shift. We are talking about a city that had been sealed away from common folk for as long as anyone could remember. And now, under Gwyndolin's command, outsiders were invited in. Fresh blood, fresh resources, people who could help rebuild what time and war had broken. But Gwyndolin was not restoring the old ways. He was creating something new. The city that rose from the ruins of Anor Londo would carry a different name, Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. This was the city of Moonlight, a successor to everything Anor Londo had been, but with a crucial difference in its identity. Where his father Gwyn had ruled under the power of sunlight, Gwyndolin would guide this new era under the moon. The entire symbolism of the divine order shifted. Sunlight had defined the age of fire. It was the source of Gwyn's power, the image plastered across every church and throne room in Lordran. But now the sun was fading, and Gwyndolin embraced the opposite. The moon became the new symbol of divine authority in Irithyll. Gwyndolin still honored his father's legacy in the ways that mattered most. He upheld the goal of linking the fire. He kept the cycle going. But the priorities of the pantheon were reshaped around dark moon ideals. This was no longer a kingdom waiting for the sun to return. This was a kingdom that had accepted the darkness between ages and found its light in the cold glow of the moon. And because Gwyndolin was the only deity of Gwyn's line still present in the capital, his position became something extraordinary. He was not just a prince or a figurehead. He became the sole divine power in Irithyll. His rule transformed the city into a theocracy of moonlight, with himself quietly sitting at the very top. Now here is where the political structure gets interesting. Gwyndolin eventually claimed the title of Allfather. In the Old Tongue, this was called Shushin, meaning chief god of the pantheon. This was a massive move. The previous Allfather had been Lloyd, Gwyn's great-uncle, who led the Way of White and its religious hierarchy across the lands. But Gwyndolin pushed Lloyd out. He supplanted his own great-uncle and took control of the entire church structure. This was the official changing of the guard for divine leadership. The age of sunlight was over. The age of moonlight had begun. Under Gwyndolин's guidance, Irithyll's culture transformed to match this new reality. The city's churches began venerating dark moon miracles. The iconography shifted to honor the crescent moon. Priests and faithful citizens alike turned their worship toward the dark sun Gwyndolin as the new divine protector of their home. But this was not a complete erasure of the past. Irithyll's people still respected the old gods. Statues of Gwyn and the other deities remained standing throughout the city. The heritage of Anor Londo was preserved in the architecture, the traditions, and the memories that had been passed down through generations. Gwyndolin was not trying to make everyone forget where they came from. He was giving them something new to believe in going forward. The city itself reflected this blend of old and new. Irithyll was built as an extension around the remnants of Anor Londo's royal district. The flying buttresses and pillared halls that had defined Gwyn's capital were still there. but modifications appeared everywhere to mark the changing times. Stained glass windows now featured the crescent crown symbol of Gwyndolin. Towering statues of the Dark Sun deity adorned the central cathedral's interior. The grand new cathedral, built to honor the Dark Moon, rose at the city's highest point, while the old cathedral where Gwyn's throne once sat was left abandoned. What emerged was a reimagined Anor Londo, a city that carried the elegance of the old world but dressed it in the colors of the moon. And yet, despite holding all this power, Gwyndolin chose to live modestly. There was a small manor in Irithyll, guarded by silver knights, that contained paintings of Anor Londo, the Duke's archives, and Guinevere. These were sentimental images tied to Gwyndolin's family. This manor, watched over by the same knights who once served the royal family, suggests that Gwyndolin made his home there. The silver knights themselves are an important detail. These warriors had served Gwyn's royal family for ages, and they continued their duty even after the former royal family had passed on. They protected Gwyndolин's manor. They guarded the old abandoned cathedral. Their loyalty extended across the transition from sun to moon without ever breaking. So picture what Irithyll looked like in this era. A glittering city of moonlight, where the most powerful god in the pantheon lived in a humble home at the corner of town. The magnificent cathedral was reserved for worship and the public image of the faith, while Gwyndolin himself stayed in the shadows. This was always his nature. Even when he held supreme power, he preferred to rule quietly, letting the institutions and the rituals speak louder than any throne. The religious life of Irithyll revolved entirely around the Dark Moon faith. The city's central church, which would later be known as the Church of Yorshka, was dedicated to those who served the Dark Moon. The design of these churches tells us something about who gathered there. They had ornate seats instead of simple pews, suggesting they hosted esteemed clergy gatherings and special rites. This was a city of noble gods' descendants, after all. The faithful here were not peasants praying in wooden chapels. They were heirs to a divine legacy. Gwyndolin integrated the old servants of Anor Londo into this new society. The painting guardians, who had once protected the magical painting of Ariamis, likely found a place in Irithyll. Human attendants who had served in the original capital continued their duties under the new order. Everyone who had been part of the old world was given a role in the new one, and for a time, this worked. Irithyll prospered quietly under Gwyndolин's stewardship. The people were faithful to the moon. The city was protected by knights, both seen and unseen. The flame continued to burn because the linking was maintained. But none of them knew what was coming. None of them could see that a stranger would one day arrive from a painted world, carrying ambition that burned hotter than any flame. And none of them could imagine how quickly everything Gwyndolin had built would be torn apart from the inside. The city of Moonlight had risen, but the chains were already being forged in the shadows. A city of Moonlight still needed enforcers, and Gwyndolin, despite his quiet nature, understood that power required more than prayers and pretty cathedrals. So he founded an order of knights, unlike anything the old regime had ever used. They were called the Blades of the Dark Moon, and their purpose was simple: hunt down sinners, protect the fragile flame, eliminate any threat to the throne before it could take root. These were not public soldiers marching through the streets in shining armor. The Dark Moon Knights operated in the shadows. They were recruited from the undead champions who wandered into Anor Londo seeking purpose, and Gwyndolin gave them exactly that: a covenant, a sworn duty to serve the god's agenda and punish those who defied divine law. Gwyndolin himself served as the original captain of this order. He personally guided the Blades of the Dark Moon, directing their missions and shaping their methods. These knights were dedicated to his father's will and the moon's vengeance. When someone committed a grave sin against the gods or threatened the cycle of fire, the Dark Moon Knights were sent to deliver judgment. A roster of these knights was kept in Irithyll. The names of every Dark Moon warrior from the age of the former royal family were recorded and preserved. This roster would remain active throughout Irithyll's golden era, showing that the Order was not just a relic of the past. It was a living institution that continued to grow and function right up until the day everything changed. But the Dark Moon Knights were only one layer of Irithyll's protection. The Silver Knights, those ancient warriors who had served Gwyn's royal family since the beginning, maintained their own role in the city. Their duty was more visible. They stood guard over holy sites and watched the streets with unwavering vigilance. Even after the former royal family had passed on, these knights continued their sworn service. They collected the severed ears of the guilty as proof of justice served, a practice they had carried over from the old days in Anor Londo. So Irithyll had two tiers of divine knights working in tandem. The public face of the faith was represented by the Silver Knights, openly guarding sacred locations and making their presence known. The secret face was the Dark Moon Blades, tracking traitors in the darkness where no one could see them coming. Both groups remained fiercely loyal to Gwyndolin and his family. Together, they formed the backbone of Irithyll's security during this peaceful era. The city could sleep soundly knowing that any threat would be met with swift and absolute force. Now there is one more figure we need to talk about. Someone who would become essential to the Dark Moon Order, and whose name would eventually be given to one of Irithyll's most important churches. Her name was Yorshka. Yorshka was Gwyndolin's younger half-sister, a mysterious crossbreed who carried the divine blood of Gwyn himself. She referred to the Lord of Sunlight as father, and she called Gwyndolin her elder brother. This places her firmly within the royal bloodline, even though her exact origins remain unclear. Some believe she had connections to the painted world, given certain details about her nature. But what matters most is that she was raised in Irithyll's confines and became part of its ruling family. Unlike her brother, Yorshka had a gentle and naive personality. She spoke softly about the duties of the Dark Moon Knights and how they watched over those who would link the fire. There was an innocence to her that set her apart from the calculating minds around her. She had grown up sheltered, protected by the walls of Irithyll and the knights who served her family. But Yorshka was not merely a princess kept away from the world. She was being trained. Gwyndolin prepared his sister to carry on the sacred duty of the Dark Moon. She learned the ways of the Order, the rituals they performed, and the responsibilities that came with leading such a covenant. In time, Yorshka would rise to the position of company captain of the Dark Moon Knights. This title was formal recognition of her role in the hierarchy. The Church of Yorshka, which sat at the heart of Irithyll's religious district, appears to have been named in her honor. This tells us something important about how the city viewed her. Yorshka was revered. She held a special status within the Dark Moon faith, even before she took on leadership duties. The people of Irithyll looked up to her as a symbol of their connection to the divine. During this golden age, Yorshka trained under Gwyndolin's guidance without any knowledge of the darkness that would eventually consume everything she knew. She trusted her brother completely. She believed in the mission of the Dark Moon Knights, and she never imagined that her role as captain would come under circumstances so terrible. For now, though, the city of Moonlight flourished. The Dark Moon Order grew stronger. The Silver Knights maintained their eternal watch, and Yorshka prepared herself for a future she thought would be bright. The structure of power in Irithyll seemed unshakable. Gwyndolin sat at the top as Allfather, quietly directing the faith from his modest manor. Yorshka stood beside him as the heir to the Dark Moon legacy. The knights enforced divine law across both the seen and unseen realms of the city, and the people worshipped faithfully, unaware of the cracks forming beneath the surface. Because somewhere out there, beyond the frozen walls of Irithyll, a young sorcerer was already plotting his escape from a painted world. He carried no divine blood. He held no loyalty to the moon or the sun. All he had was ambition, and it burned inside him like a flame that would never go out. The order that Gwyndolin had built was about to face a challenge it could never have anticipated, and the gentle Yorshka, who knew only kindness and duty, would soon learn what it meant to be caught in the middle of a war for power. But that story belongs to another chapter. For now, the blades of the Dark Moon stood ready in the shadows, faithful to their captain and their cause. The city of Moonlight was at peace. It would not last. While Irithyll flourished under moonlight, something was stirring in a world that existed outside of reality itself. The painted world of Ariandel was a cold and forlorn realm sealed away from everything else. It was a place where lost souls found refuge, a frozen asylum for those who had experienced great despair and had nowhere else to go. Snow covered everything. The air was bitter. And within this isolated painting, a child was born who would one day reshape the fate of Irithyll forever. His name was Sulyvahn. Unlike most who dwelled in the painted world, Sulyvahn had not arrived there seeking escape from suffering. He was born and raised inside the painting itself. This was his home from the very beginning, and from an early age, he showed remarkable talent for sorcery. The extreme cold of Ariandel became the foundation of his magical abilities. Sulyvahn developed unique frost-based spells that took advantage of the freezing temperatures around him. Snap Freeze, Frozen Weapon. These sorceries were his own creations, born from years of practice in the icy wastes of his homeland. The young sorcerer was a prodigy, mastering powers that no one else in the painting could match. But there was something different about Sulyvahn. Something that set him apart from every other resident of the painted world. The people who lived in Ariandel had typically experienced loss. They had known despair. That shared suffering was what bound them together and gave the painting its purpose as a sanctuary. Sulyvahn had not experienced any of that. He had no great tragedy in his past, no wound that needed healing. He existed in the painting without ever truly belonging to it. This detachment would prove to be the spark that ignited everything. Sulyvahn grew dissatisfied with the confines of Ariandel. The painting was meant to be a peaceful asylum, but for him, it felt like a prison. He looked around at the frozen landscape and the forlorn souls who inhabited it, and he saw nothing that could satisfy his ambitions. The young sorcerer craved knowledge. He craved real experiences. He wanted more than a painted world could ever offer. So he made a decision that almost no one had ever made before. He resolved to leave. Escaping the painted world was supposed to be impossible. Once you entered, you stayed. That was the nature of these magical paintings. They were designed to contain and protect their inhabitants, not to let them wander back into the outside world. But Sulyvahn succeeded where others had failed. Through sheer determination and arcane skill, he found a way out. When he left, he abandoned everything behind. The frost sorceries he had created remained in Ariandel, left for future adventurers to discover in the frozen wastes. He took nothing from his birthplace except his knowledge and his burning desire for power. Sulyvahn turned his back on his homeland and its inhabitants without a second thought. They meant nothing to him. The painting had given him life, but it could not give him purpose. This was the first sign of the ruthlessness that would define his character. Sulyvahn was willing to cast aside everything and everyone if it meant reaching something greater. That quality would serve him well in the years to come. After escaping the painted world, Sulyvahn eventually found his way to a legendary place, Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, the city of Moonlight, the home of the god's descendants and the seat of Allfather Gwyndolин's power. For someone who had grown up in a frozen painting, Irithyll must have seemed like a dream. Here was a real city with real people, built on the bones of the ancient capital, Anor Londo. The architecture was breathtaking, the faith was strong, and the rulers were actual deities with divine blood running through their veins. Sulyvahn had no divine blood himself. He was a commoner in the truest sense, an outsider who had literally come from another dimension. By all rights, he should have been turned away at the gates. Irithyll's society was built around noble lineages and the descendants of gods. A stranger from a painted world had no place among them. But Sulyvahn was welcomed. His intelligence impressed the Irithylians. His magical skill was undeniable. The talented sorcerer from Ariandel managed to earn acceptance among the city's nobles, despite having no credentials beyond his own abilities. This was an unusual case. Someone with no connection to the old bloodlines had been granted entry into one of the most exclusive societies in existence. And then Gwyndolin himself took notice. The Allfather recognized Sulyvahn's potential and decided to take him under his patronage. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. Gwyndolin, the chief god of the pantheon and ruler of Irithyll, had personally acknowledged this young outsider. Sulyvahn proved his loyalty in a clever way. He crafted a crude replica of Gwyndolин's own catalyst, the Dark Moon Tin Catalyst, which was a sacred instrument of the Dark Moon faith. This replica, known as the Golden Ritual Spear, was offered to the Dark Moon Knights as a ceremonial weapon. It was a homage, a show of respect, and it worked exactly as Sulyvahn intended. Gwyndolin was pleased. The gesture earned Sulyvahn favor with the most powerful being in Irithyll. From that point forward, Sulyvahn's rise through the city's ranks was swift. He was granted a place among the sorcerers or clergy of Irithyll, despite his foreign origins. Some believe that the distant manor on Irithyll's outskirts was originally assigned to Sulyvahn as a residence, a modest home at the edge of the city that reflected his status as a newcomer, welcomed by the nobles. Sulyvahn integrated himself into Irithyll's upper circles with remarkable speed. He went from being a wanderer with nothing to being an insider with access to power. He likely took on duties in the church or the magic academy, building connections and learning everything he could about how the city operated. All the while, he watched. He observed the political landscape with careful eyes. Gwyndolin was revered but physically ailing. The Irithylian nobles and clergy handled the day-to-day affairs of running the city. There were gaps in the power structure, opportunities for someone ambitious enough to exploit them. The humble painter boy from Ariandel began to see a grand opportunity taking shape. He had escaped one world only to find himself in another that was ripe for the taking. Gwyndolin had given him everything he needed to succeed: a position, connections, knowledge of how Irithyll's institutions functioned. Sulyvahn's ambition ignited in Irithyll. The flame that burned inside him had not yet revealed its full darkness, but it was growing stronger with every passing day. He had come to this city with nothing, and now he stood among its elite, accepted and trusted. No one suspected what he was planning. No one could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. The outsider had become an insider, and soon he would begin reaching for something far greater than anyone had ever offered him. The seeds of corruption had been planted, and the city of Moonlight had no idea what was growing in its shadow. Beneath the frozen outskirts of Irithyll, something ancient was waiting to be found. During his youth in the city, Sulyvahn ventured deep underground and stumbled upon ruins that most had forgotten even existed. The profaned capital, an ancient cursed city buried in the tundra, known as the realm of the exiled giant Lord Yorm. Its halls were coated in frost and littered with corpses from some great tragedy that had occurred ages before. And in those icy ruins, Sulyvahn discovered a source of power that would change everything. The profaned flame. Where the first flame that Gwyn had linked would eventually fade and require rekindling, the profaned flame was different. It was unfading. It burned with a cold, never-dying light that had persisted through the ages without diminishing. The flame was preserved in the corpse-strewn remains of the capital, still burning despite the frost and death surrounding it. Even more significant was what the profaned flame contained. Within its ever-burning core was the essence of the dark itself, the humanity of humans. This was a fire that held darkness at its heart, a twisted mirror of the first flame that the gods had fought so hard to maintain. The moment Sulyvahn obtained the profaned flame, a burning ambition took root inside him. He understood immediately what this discovery meant. This eerie fire could grant him limitless power, unlike the first flame that the Lords of Cinder had to sacrifice themselves to rekindle again and again. The profaned flame was everlasting. It would never go out. It would never need a champion to throw themselves into its embers. Sulyvahn saw the political and religious significance of such a fire. The entire faith of Irithyll, the entire Way of White, was built around the cycle of linking the first flame. But what if there was another flame? What if someone possessed a fire that did not need to be linked because it could never fade? Possessing the profaned flame set Sulyvahn apart from every other being in Irithyll. He was no longer a talented sorcerer serving the gods. In his own mind, he now held the tool to become something godlike himself. From this point forward, his tolerance for servitude began to wane. The profaned flame fueled a desire to dominate, to reshape the entire hierarchy of Irithyll, with himself sitting at the very top. Sulyvahn began to plot. He recognized that openly confronting Gwyndolin or the entrenched clergy would be far too risky. The Allfather still commanded loyalty throughout the city. The Dark Moon Knights and Silver Knights would crush any direct challenge. So instead of acting boldly, the young sorcerer moved with caution and cunning. He expanded his influence from within. Sulyvahn likely rose through the church ranks, attaining a position among the higher clergy of the Way of White in Irithyll. At the same time, he cultivated loyalties among the knights and soldiers. He made connections, built relationships, positioned himself as a trusted figure in the institution that held power. The profaned flame gave him a secret weapon in this effort. Its dark allure could corrupt hearts. Sulyvahn used this to enthrall others, turning their convictions toward his cause without them ever realizing what was happening. His ambition went beyond seizing political control. Sulyvahn wanted to remake the very belief system of Irithyll around himself and the profaned flame. He saw that the first flame was destined to fade. It always had. It always would. But his flame would endure forever. In his vision, Sulyvahn would supplant the old fire-based faith with something new, a religion centered on the profaned flame. And he would be the prophet king of this new age, ruling over a city that worshipped an everlasting fire with him as its keeper. Step by step, he sowed the seeds of corruption in Irithyll's institutions. Cunning manipulation turned key figures to his side. Those who could not be persuaded were neutralized through other means. The flame in his grasp was sinister and unholy. It had once been condemned by the very church he now served. But Sulyvahn began introducing it in secret, using its power to convert the faithful one by one. Those who met Sulyvahn during this period saw only what he wanted them to see: a devout and rising priest, a skilled sorcerer moving up through the hierarchy. No one suspected the darkness growing behind his careful mask. By the time Gwyndolin's health would fail, Sulyvahn intended to have every piece in place. The knights, the clergy, the systems of power. All of it would be ready to fall into his hands the moment the opportunity arrived. The discovery of the profaned flame marks the point where Irithyll's story takes its dark turn. This was the beginning of the end for the city's age of benevolent moonlight. The dawn of a corrupted regime was approaching, forged by a sorcerer who had found an unfading fire and decided that he deserved to wield it over everyone else. The chains were being prepared, and no one in the city of moonlight could see them coming. The first phase of Sulyvahn's plan targeted the one group that could stop him if they remained loyal to Gwyndolin, the Holy Knights of Irithyll. These warriors had dedicated themselves to the Way of White and the protection of the city's faith. They were the backbone of Irithyll's military strength. If Sulyvahn wanted to seize power without a direct confrontation, he needed these knights on his side. And if he could not win their loyalty through persuasion, he would take it through corruption. The profaned flame became his tool. Using the dark power of that unfading fire, Sulyvahn began to bewitch the holy knights one by one. The flame had a sinister allure that could warp convictions and twist minds. Knights who had once sworn themselves to the moon, and the old gods found their beliefs shifting towards something else entirely. They started to revere the profaned flame as if it were sacred, even though it was the very definition of heresy against everything the Way of White stood for. The knights did not realize what was happening to them. In their minds, they were still faithful servants of Irithyll. But in truth, their allegiance had been transferred. They no longer answered to All-Father Gwyndolin. They answered to Sulyvahn. This corruption spread quietly through the ranks. The knights still appeared to serve the city and its faith. They still wore their armor and carried out their duties. But behind the scenes, they had become something different. A private militia, a secret police force loyal only to the sorcerer who had claimed their hearts. Sulyvahn used them as his watchful eyes around Irithyll. These corrupted knights spied on potential enemies and reported back to their new master. When someone needed to disappear, they handled it. The enforcers of divine law had become enforcers of Sulyvahn's will, and no one outside his inner circle understood the change that had taken place. As the knights fell deeper under the profaned flame's influence, their very nature began to transform. They abandoned the miracles they had once practiced and embraced sorceries and occult arts that would have been forbidden under the old order. The pious warriors who had served Gwyn's legacy were becoming something darker, something colder. Their fighting style changed. Frost began to cling to their blades and armor, a mark of Sulyvahn's sorcerous power flowing through them. These were no longer the lightning-touched knights of previous generations. Their weapons carried the chill of Sulyvahn's magic. Their eyes held the emptiness of men whose souls had been hollowed out and refilled with someone else's purpose. Some accounts describe tattoos or symbols of eyes embedded in their gear. These marked them as extensions of Sulyvahn's vision. Wherever a corrupted knight walked, Sulyvahn could see. Whatever they witnessed, he knew, but the corruption did not stop with simple loyalty shifts. The most devout among the holy knights underwent a far more dramatic transformation. Those who accepted the profaned flame most completely became fire witches. These mysterious figures had once been knights sworn to protect Irithyll's faith. Now they walked the streets in ceremonial robes and tall pointed hats, carrying weapons called immolation tinders. These ritual staves served as both catalysts for sorcery and torches for the profane fire that danced upon them. The flames that flickered on these weapons were not natural. They burned with the dark essence of the profaned flame, a heretical light that would have horrified any true believer of the old ways. These were warriors who had once considered fire sorcery to be forbidden. The Way of White had condemned such practices. The knights of Gwyn's era had wielded lightning. The followers of Gwyndolin had channeled moonlight. Fire belonged to a different tradition entirely, one that had been viewed with suspicion at best. But now these transformed knights fanned the dark flames enthusiastically. They had abandoned everything they once believed and replaced it with devotion to Sulyvahn's profane power. Clad in their ceremonial garb, the Fire Witches patrolled Irithyll as enforcers of a new doctrine that had not yet been officially declared. They struck down anyone who questioned the changes happening around them. They cast fire at dissenters and heretics, which was deeply ironic, given that they themselves had become the greatest heretics the city had ever seen. Irithyll's ordinary soldiers and footmen also fell under Sulyvahn's influence. These common troops had traditionally served under the command of the Holy Knights, following the same chain of authority that had existed since Anor Londo's Golden Age. Sulyvahn changed that by giving them weapons enchanted with freezing sorcery. The Irithyll Straightsword became the signature blade of these frost-touched soldiers. It emitted bitter cold with every swing, a reflection of the chilly magic that Sulyvahn had mastered back in his days within the Painted World. By granting these weapons to the common guardsmen, the Pontiff ensured that even the lowest-ranking soldier carried a piece of his power. Every blade in Irithyll became a symbol of the new order, whether its wielder understood that or not. The result was that Irithyll's entire standing army had effectively become Pontiff Knights. Some wielded the profane fire of the transformed witches. Others carried frost-enchanted steel that bit with supernatural cold. All of them answered to commanders chosen by Sulyvahn. If you had walked through Irithyll during this period, you would have witnessed something deeply unsettling. Fire witches wandering the darkened streets, their immolation tinders casting flickering light against the snow-covered buildings. Beside them marched knights with icy blades, their breath misting in the cold air, their eyes holding that same hollow loyalty that marked all of Sulyvahn's servants. Where once knights bore the symbols of Gwyn's sunlight or Gwyndolин's moonlight, now they brandished profane fire and bitter frost in service of a sorcerer who answered to no god. And the strangest part was that Gwyndolin was still nominally in charge. The Allfather remained in his manor. The Dark Moon Knights still technically existed. The official hierarchy of power had not changed at all. But beneath the surface, the entire military structure of Irithyll had been stolen away. By the time anyone might have noticed something was wrong, it was already too late. Sulyvahn controlled the military strength of Irithyll. The knights who should have protected the Allfather from any threat were now the greatest threat themselves. They would follow Sulyvahn's commands without question. They would turn on their former lords the moment he gave the order. Through guile and the seductive corruption of the profaned flame, he had claimed Irithyll's armed forces right out from under the ruling deities. Gwyndolin still sat in his manor. Yorshka still trained with the Dark Moon Order. But the swords that should have defended them now belonged to someone else. The city that Gwyndolin had built on trust and faith was being infiltrated by watchers who served a hidden master. All of it had occurred under the surface while Gwyndolin was still nominally in charge, showing just how deeply Sulyvahn's corruption had spread prior to his open coup. Sulyvahn could have seized control at any moment. The only reason he waited was because the timing was not yet perfect. He needed one more thing to happen before making his move. He needed Gwyndolin to become too weak to resist. At the peak of this mounting tension, the moment Sulyvahn had been waiting for finally arrived. Dark Sun Gwyndolin fell grievously ill. The nature of this illness remains mysterious. Some believe it was a curse. Others suspect poisoning. Whatever caused it, the effect was devastating. Gwyndolin, the Allfather of the Pantheon, and the linchpin holding the entire Moonlit theocracy together, became too weak to govern. Yorshka would later recount this terrible time with simple words. Her brother was stricken by illness. That was all she said about it, but those few words carried the weight of everything that followed. Gwyndolin retreated from public view entirely. He likely became bedridden somewhere in the old cathedral, the former throne room of Anor Londo, where his father Gwyn had once ruled. The god who had rebuilt this city and guided it through generations of peace was now confined and helpless, unable to lead his people through the storm that was about to break. Irithyll found itself without its divine figurehead at the worst possible moment. The city's official leader had vanished behind closed doors, and the institutions he had created were left scrambling to respond. The Way of White Church needed to make some kind of interim arrangement. Someone had to take responsibility for leading Irithyll's protectors and maintaining the sacred rites that kept the faith alive. The answer came from the royal bloodline itself. Leadership of the Dark Moon Knights passed to Company Captain Yorshka. She confirmed this herself when she later spoke of those days. The leadership of the Knights fell to her. Those were her exact words, and they described a situation no one had ever expected. Yorshka had trained for this role, but she had never been heavily involved in actually ruling the city. Her position had always been ceremonial in many ways. A princess preparing for duties that seemed far in the future. Now those duties had arrived without warning, and she was thrust into command of the Blades of the Dark Moon and all the responsibilities that came with them. She did her best. Yorshka continued reciting her brother's ritual phrases. She guided the Dark Moon Knights according to the traditions Gwyndolin had established. She watched over those who would link the fire, just as the Covenant had always done. In practice, she became the symbolic head of Irithyll's defenders and the last living authority of Gwyn's bloodline still active in the city. But Yorshka faced challenges that her sheltered upbringing had never prepared her for. She was isolated. Her base of operations was the high tower near Anor Londo, a place that would later become known as the Prison Tower for very different reasons. From that elevated position, Yorshka could oversee the Covenant's activities, but she was physically separated from the political machinery of Irithyll itself. She had no network of informants. She had no experience with the kind of scheming that powerful people engaged in behind closed doors. And crucially, she had no idea how deeply the corruption had already spread through the city she was now supposed to protect. The knights she thought were loyal to her family had already been turned. The soldiers who should have defended the Dark Moon faith now answered to someone else. The entire military structure of Irithyll had been hollowed out and replaced with Sulyvahn's servants, and Yorshka, sitting in her tower reciting prayers, knew nothing of it. She was gentle in a world that was about to become brutal. She was trusting in a city full of betrayers, and she was alone at the exact moment when she needed allies most. Sulyvahn had waited years for this opportunity. He had corrupted the knights. He had transformed the soldiers. He had built a shadow government inside Irithyll's institutions, while the real government continued to function above him. All of it had been preparation for the day when Gwyndolin could no longer stand in his way. That day had arrived. The Allfather lay weakened beyond recovery. The only other authority in the city was an inexperienced princess isolated in a tower. Everything Sulyvahn needed was now in place. The time had come to seize the throne. Sulyvahn struck with precision. The sorcerer who had spent years building his shadow government finally stepped out of the shadows and claimed what he believed was rightfully his. He proclaimed himself Pontiff of Irithyll. In the language of that era, the word Pontiff carried enormous weight. It meant a high pope, a supreme priest-king. By taking this title, Sulyvahn was declaring himself the religious and political leader of the entire city. He would act in the place of the gods themselves. Yorshka would later recall this moment with bitter clarity. Sulyvahn wrongfully proclaimed himself pontiff. Those were her words, and they captured the betrayal that defined this turning point. The man who had been welcomed into Irithyll as an outsider, who had been given patronage and position by Gwyndolin himself, had now seized everything for his own. Sulyvahn presented his new title as a necessary measure. He claimed he was maintaining order during the Allfather's unfortunate absence. The transition was masked as a temporary regency, a placeholder until Gwyndolin recovered and could resume his duties. But anyone paying close attention would have seen through the lie immediately. Sulyvahn wasted no time solidifying his claim. He placed himself at the head of the Irithyllian church, outranking every other member of the clergy. The entire religious hierarchy that had served Gwyndolin now answered to the pontiff instead. This was not the behavior of someone planning to hand power back, but claiming the title was only the first step. Sulyvahn knew that as long as Gwyndolin and Yorshka remained free, they would serve as rallying points for anyone loyal to the old regime. The Silver Knights might rise up. The remaining Dark Moon faithful might organize resistance. To prevent this, the pontiff needed to neutralize both heirs of Gwyn's bloodline. He moved against Gwyndolin first. The weakened Allfather was taken from wherever he had been recovering and imprisoned in the old abandoned cathedral of Anor Londo. This was the same building where Gwyn's throne had once stood, the same mausoleum where the Lord of Sunlight's memory was preserved. Beneath the massive rotating elevator that connected the cathedral to the rest of Irithyll, Gwyndolin was shackled and bound. The symbolism was deliberate. The god who had rebuilt Anor Londo and transformed it into Irithyll was now a prisoner in his father's own tomb. Sulyvahn had turned the most sacred space in the city into a cell for its rightful ruler. Gwyndolin became a hostage. His continued survival was the only thing preventing the Silver Knights and any remaining loyalists from attempting a rescue or rebellion. If they moved against the pontiff, Gwyndolin would suffer the consequences. Sulyvahn held the Allfather's life in his hands, and everyone knew it. Yorshka faced the same fate. The pontiff's forces seized her in the high tower where she had been operating. The same tower that housed the Church of Yorshka, the building named in her honor, became her prison. Yorshka herself later confirmed what happened in the simplest terms. He took her prisoner. She was isolated at the very top of the tower, guarded by Sulyvahn's Outriders to ensure she could not escape or communicate with potential allies. Time lost meaning for Yorshka in that cell. When others eventually found her, she seemed unaware of how long she had been confined. Days, months, years. The gentle princess who had inherited command of the Dark Moon Knights was now trapped in darkness, cut off from everything she had known. By capturing both heirs of Gwyn in a single decisive action, Sulyvahn created a stalemate that no one could break. The Silver Knights dared not rebel because the pontiff could execute their beloved leaders at any moment. The Dark Moon faithful had no one to rally behind. Every potential source of resistance had been neutralized through the threat of harm to the hostages. It was a swift and bloodless coup. No armies clashed in the streets. No great battle decided the fate of the city. Sulyvahn took the most important people in Irithyll and locked them away where no one could reach them. With those prisoners in hand, his claim as Pontiff King became unassailable. What followed was the rapid transformation of everything Irithyll had once been. Sulyvahn assumed full command of the city and presented himself as the rightful interim ruler, carrying out the will of the gods. But his actions revealed the truth. Ancient records in the church archives noted his new title, using the old term that meant Law King or Pope. This designation signified that Sulyvahn had placed himself above even the laws of the old gods. He answered to no one. He was accountable to nothing. The populace of Irithyll, confused and leaderless after Gwyndolин's disappearance, largely submitted to the new order. What choice did they have? The Pontiff's knights enforced curfews throughout the city. Obedience was no longer requested. It was demanded. Sulyvahn began issuing edicts that reshaped every institution in Irithyll. The church hierarchy was restructured to answer to him alone. Clergy who showed any resistance quietly disappeared into the dungeons that Sulyvahn would soon expand into monuments of cruelty. The common people were told only that the Allfather was ill, and that this pontiff would lead temporarily until he recovered. None of them realized the truth. Sulyvahn had no intention of ever relinquishing power. The temporary regency was permanent from the moment he declared it. Gwyndolin would never be released. Yorshka would never be freed. The Moonlit theocracy that had governed Irithyll for generations was over. In its place rose something far darker, a regime built on hostages and fear. A city where the chains of authority wrapped around every citizen, binding them to a ruler who had stolen his throne through cunning and betrayal. The city of Moonlight had become the city of chains, and the pontiff was only beginning. Securing the throne was only the beginning. Now, Sulyvahn needed to ensure that no one could ever take it from him. The blades of the Dark Moon had to be destroyed. These elite knights had sworn themselves to Gwyndolin. They were the secret enforcers of the old order, the ones who had hunted sinners and protected the flame for generations. As long as any of them remained free, they represented a threat. A Dark Moon Knight, with nothing left to lose, might attempt to rescue the imprisoned Allfather. A group of them, working together, could spark a rebellion that would spread through the city. Sulyvahn declared them heretics under the new order. His forces began hunting the Dark Moon Knights relentlessly. The Pontiff Knights, who had once served alongside these warriors, now turned on them without hesitation. The corruption of the profaned flame had severed whatever bonds of brotherhood might have existed. To the corrupted knights, the Dark Moon Blades were enemies of the state, traitors to be eliminated. The Purge was thorough and merciless. According to the accounts that survived, Sulyvahn either exiled or executed every Dark Moon Knight he could find. The order that had protected Irithyll since its founding was systematically dismantled until there were no more knights remaining. Some of them managed to flee before the pontiff's forces could reach them. These survivors went into hiding, scattering across distant lands where Sulyvahn's influence could not follow. Others were not so fortunate. They were cut down by pontiff knights in the streets of the city they had sworn to protect, their bodies left as warnings to anyone else who might consider resistance. By the end of the Purge, the Dark Moon's direct military presence in Irithyll had been completely eliminated. The Covenant itself would persist in secret, kept alive by Yorshka's prayers from her prison tower, but its physical order had been destroyed. Yorshka would later speak of this tragedy with quiet sadness. The Dark Moon Knights had lost their last proper knight long ago. All that remained were memories and the ghosts of what had once been. But the Dark Moon Knights were not the only targets. Sulyvahn extended his purge to every servant of the old royal family. Anyone with ties to Gwyn's bloodline or Gwyndolин's regime became a target for elimination or enslavement. The Painting Guardians were among the first to fall. These silent watchers had protected the magical painting in Anor Londo's cathedral for as long as anyone could remember. They were a living link to the mysteries of the painted world, guardians of secrets that predated even Gwyndolин's rule. Sulyvahn wiped them out entirely. Their distinctive white garments, stained with evidence of their fate, could later be found scattered throughout Irithyll. The sacred painting of Ariamis was left without its protectors, abandoned to whatever might come. The giants suffered a different but equally terrible fate. In the glorious days of Anor Londo, giants had been friends and allies to the gods. The giant blacksmith had forged weapons for Gwyn's knights. Giant sentinels had stood watch over the city's gardens and walls. These were proud beings who served through bonds of loyalty and respect. Sulyvahn had no interest in loyalty or respect. To him, giants were resources to be exploited. Every giant remaining in Irithyll was enslaved. The sentinels who had once stood proudly in the outer gardens found themselves shackled, their freedom stripped away. They were put to work on manual labor, their immense strength used for whatever purposes the pontiff demanded. Some were subjected to dark experiments in the dungeons that Sulyvahn was constructing beneath the city. One giant in particular, possibly a survivor from the profaned capital and Yorm's fallen people, was imprisoned in the depths of the Irithyll dungeon. This creature, far from home and stripped of dignity, represented everything the pontiff had done to the old alliances. The covenants and friendships that the gods had maintained for ages meant nothing to Sulyvahn. He saw only tools and obstacles, and he dealt with both accordingly. The higher clergy of Irithyll faced the same choice that everyone else did: submit or suffer. Those who opposed Sulyvahn's blasphemous takeover either fled the city entirely or were eliminated. A schism was forming in the broader way of white faith, one that would eventually see entire religious centers break away from Irithyll's corrupted church. But within the city itself, opposition was crushed before it could organize. Priests who spoke against the pontiff vanished into the dungeons. Archdeacons who refused to bend the knee found themselves accused of heresy by the very institution they had served. The streets of Irithyll grew quiet during this period. Fear kept people inside their homes. The pontiff's knights patrolled constantly, watching for any sign of dissent. The citizens who had once lived under the gentle rule of Gwyndolin now learned what it meant to exist under a tyrant who tolerated no challenge to his authority. By the end of the Purge, the Moonlit theocracy that had governed Irithyll for so long was thoroughly dismantled. Every institution, every tradition, every symbol of the old order had been either destroyed or bent to serve Sulyvahn's purposes. The blades of the Dark Moon existed only as spirits summoned through secret prayers. The giants labored in chains. The painting guardians lay in unmarked graves. The clergy either served the pontiff or rotted in his dungeons. All that remained of Gwyndolин's Irithyll were vestiges. Hidden acolytes who practiced the old faith in secret. A frightened citizenry who remembered better days but dared not speak of them. And somewhere in a tower, a princess who had lost everything, praying to a moon that could no longer protect her. Sulyvahn stood at the pinnacle of power, unchallenged and unchallengeable. He had cleansed the city of anyone who might spark rebellion. The noble order of Dark Moon Knights was gone. The benevolent giants were in chains. The sacred traditions were ashes. The city of Moonlight had been transformed completely. What remained was something else entirely. A city bound by fear and ruled by chains. A kingdom built on the bones of everything that had come before. One final problem required a quieter solution. A cleric named Aldrich, whose appetites had grown monstrous and whose habits threatened to tarnish the new regime, was quietly banished to the distant cathedral of the deep before the public ever learned the full truth. And the pontiff was only getting started. Every tyrant needs a place to put the people who refuse to obey. Sulyvahn built his beneath the frozen earth of Irithyll. The Irithyll dungeon was constructed near the ruins of the profaned capital, accessible by a lift that descended from the city above into the cold depths below. This prison complex was designed from the ground up as a monument of fear. Row upon row of iron-barred cells stretched through the underground labyrinth. Torture chambers, filled with horrific devices, occupied the darker corners. The regal halls of Anor Londo that had once defined this region were now shadowed by something far more sinister hidden beneath them. Sulyvahn did not build this dungeon from nothing. He incorporated what was already there, repurposing ancient structures for his own ends. Most notably, the new prison was constructed encircling what records call the oldest cell of a giant. This suggests that long before Sulyvahn ever arrived, someone had imprisoned a giant in these depths. Perhaps it was a cell from Yorm's time, or a holding place for one of his people. Whatever its original purpose, Sulyvahn claimed it and made it the foundation of his own monument to cruelty. By building around a giant's cell, the Pontiff sent a message that no one could miss. Even the mighty could be caged. Even the powerful could be brought low. No creature, no matter how strong, was beyond the reach of Sulyvahn's chains. To oversee this underground nightmare, Sulyvahn needed wardens who could match the horror of the place itself. He found them among the survivors of the profaned capital's collapse. These were the jailers. The people who became jailers had already known suffering before Sulyvahn found them. They were captives or refugees from the ancient catastrophe that had destroyed the profaned capital ages ago. They had endured whatever terrible events had consumed that cursed city. And now Sulyvahn took these broken survivors and twisted them into something even worse. He turned victims into tormentors. The jailers stalk the dungeon, wearing grim hooded robes that hide their faces from view. In their hands they carry red-hot branding irons, instruments of pain that never seem to cool. Their presence fills the corridors with a quiet dread that is somehow worse than screaming. They move with tranquil poise, unhurried and deliberate, as if they have all the time in the world to inflict whatever suffering they choose. But the brands are not the most disturbing thing about the jailers. These wardens possess an ability that defies natural explanation. Simply by gazing upon their prisoners, they can sap the vigor from a living being. The health and strength drains away under their stare, leaving victims weakened and trembling with fear before any physical harm has even been inflicted. It is psychological warfare made manifest, terror weaponized into something that attacks the body as well as the mind. The law of their attire confirms what they once were: prisoners themselves, people who suffered under circumstances they could not control, now transformed into instruments for inflicting that same suffering on others. Sulyvahn understood something fundamental about human nature. Those who have been broken can be rebuilt into tools of oppression, their own pain channeled outward against new targets. The jailers ensure that the dungeon remains a place of utter despair. They torture inmates both psychologically and physically. They maintain an atmosphere where hope cannot survive. Every prisoner who enters those iron cells understands immediately that they have been consigned to a hell from which escape is nearly impossible, and the prisoners themselves came from every corner of Sulyvahn's enemies. Dissidents who spoke against the Pontiff's rule found themselves dragged into the depths. Knights who had remained loyal to the old regime and refused to bend were thrown into cells alongside common criminals. Sorcerers who possessed knowledge that Sulyvahn wanted but refused to share were subjected to whatever methods the jailers deemed necessary to loosen their tongues. The dungeon also held captives from beyond Irithyll's borders. A dark sorceress named Carla was locked away in one of the cells, her forbidden knowledge apparently too dangerous to be allowed freedom. Scholars from distant lands who had come seeking lost sorceries found themselves imprisoned instead of enlightened. A yellow-robed seeker of ancient magic, an elder sorcerer from Vinheim, nobles and academics from places that had no quarrel with Irithyll, swept up in the Pontiff's paranoia and locked away where no one would ever find them. The undead posed a particular problem for any prison. These cursed beings could not truly perish, which meant traditional execution was meaningless. So Sulyvahn locked them in the dungeon and left them there. Hapless undead, who were seen as threats to the regime, were consigned to cells where they would remain for eternity, unable to escape and unable to truly end their torment. The dungeon also held evidence of Sulyvahn's darker experiments. In the deepest chambers, the Pontiff had attempted to transform human prisoners into pale dragons. He sought the everlasting power that dragons had possessed before Gwyn toppled them in ages past. Every attempt failed. The victims emerged as malformed creatures called wretches, their bodies elongated and their tailbones distended, but possessing none of the true power Sulyvahn craved. These stunted failures were discarded into the pits below, left to crawl and moan in eternal agony. Above ground, the oppression created monsters of a different kind. The enslaved citizens who labored under Sulyvahn's regime suffered so deeply that the dark within their souls began to manifest. Their humanity curdled into something savage. They transformed into beasts with the bodies of massive hounds, and the faces of screaming men fused into their flesh. These creatures prowled the fringes of Irithyll, lurking beneath bridges and in flooded basements, serving as guard dogs that devoured anyone foolish enough to attempt escape. The Pontiff allowed these transformations to continue. Every monster born from human despair became another weapon in his arsenal of fear. The wails that echoed through those corridors spoke to horrors that the outside world could scarcely imagine. Experiments were conducted in the deeper chambers. Things were done to prisoners that changed them into something no longer recognizable as human. Abominations emerged from the intersection of torture and dark sorcery, creatures that would later serve as evidence of just how far Sulyvahn's depravity had gone. The Irithyll dungeon stands in the lore as the physical manifestation of everything the Pontiff truly was. Above ground, Irithyll maintained some semblance of its former beauty. The moonlit streets and elegant architecture still existed, even if fear now filled them. But below, in the cold labyrinth beneath the city, the truth was laid bare. This was where Sulyvahn stored the evidence of his cruelties. This was where the bodies were hidden, and the screams were muffled by stone walls too thick for sound to escape. This was the underbelly of the holy city, the price paid for the order that the Pontiff enforced above. Anyone who questioned whether Sulyvahn was truly a monster needed only to descend that lift and walk those corridors. The iron bars, the branding irons, the hollow eyes of the jailers, and the whimpering of the damned told the whole story. The city of Moonlight had a shadow underneath it, and that shadow was shaped like a dungeon. Sulyvahn had seized the throne. He had imprisoned the gods. He had purged the loyalists and built a dungeon to house anyone who might oppose him. But there was one more thing he needed to complete his control over Irithyll. He needed to seal the city shut. The Pontiff cast a powerful barrier around the entire Boreal Valley. This magical seal was likely powered by moonlight or the profaned flame, perhaps both working in terrible harmony. The enchantment acted as an invisible wall at the entrance to Irithyll, a force that stopped anyone from passing through without proper authorization. The only way through was a tiny figurine, the small doll. This miniature idol served as the key to Irithyll's barrier. Without one, any traveler approaching the city would find the frigid air itself refusing to let them pass. The cold would push back against them, an invisible force that could not be overcome through strength or willpower. Only by presenting a small doll could someone cross the threshold and enter the Boreal Valley. Sulyvahn distributed these dolls carefully. They went to his most valued subjects, the people he trusted to leave and return without causing problems, envoys who carried his messages to distant lands. double agents like the Outrider Knights who served his purposes beyond the valley's borders. Each doll represented not just permission to travel, but membership in the Pontiff's inner circle of approved subjects. The description of the small doll reveals something chilling about its purpose. It is called an idol that reminds Irithyll's subjects that their home will always be in the Boreal Valley. Even those trusted enough to leave temporarily were psychologically chained to the city. The doll was a constant reminder that they belonged to Sulyvahn's domain. No matter how far they traveled, they would always return. They had no choice. This system gave the Pontiff absolute control over movement in and out of Irithyll. He knew exactly who had dolls and who did not. He could grant the privilege of travel to those who served him well, and revoke it from anyone who fell out of favor. Movement was no longer a right that citizens enjoyed. It was a privilege that the Pontiff bestowed upon the obedient. For the common people of Irithyll, the barrier meant something even more severe. They were trapped. The citizens who had once lived in a city open to pilgrims and visitors now found themselves locked inside their own home. They could not leave the Boreal Valley without a doll, and dolls were not given to ordinary people. The magical seal that kept outsiders from entering also kept insiders from escaping. Irithyll had become a cage disguised as a city. This isolation served multiple purposes for Sulyvahn's regime. First, it prevented anyone from fleeing to warn the outside world about what was happening. The purges, the dungeons, the imprisonment of gods. All of these atrocities remained hidden behind the barrier. Refugees who might have spread word of Sulyvahn's tyranny could not escape to tell their stories. The truth stayed locked inside the valley, along with everyone who knew it. Second, the barrier cut Irithyll off from the traditional routes of the Way of White. Pilgrims who had once traveled to Anor Londo to pay respects to the old gods could no longer reach the city. The religious connections that had linked Irithyll to the broader faith were severed. The Pontiff no longer needed to answer to anyone outside his borders. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the isolation allowed Sulyvahn to control information completely. The outside world, to common Irithyllians, became a source of fear and suspicion. Sulyvahn could craft whatever narrative he wanted. He could paint external powers as threats that the barrier protected them from. He could claim that the isolation was necessary for the city's safety. He could hide the truth of his deeds from neighboring lands, while simultaneously hiding the truth of the outside world from his own citizens. Knowledge became as controlled as movement. The people of Irithyll knew only what the Pontiff wanted them to know. And what he wanted them to know was that the barrier kept them safe, that the outside world was dangerous, and that their home would always be in the Boreal Valley, whether they liked it or not. This was a drastic reversal of everything Gwyndolin had built. When the Dark Sun had ruled, he had opened the gates of Anor Londo to outsiders. He had welcomed undead heroes and pilgrims. He had tried to rebuild the city by bringing in fresh blood and new ideas from beyond its walls. That openness had been the foundation of Irithyll's renewal. Sulyvahn slammed those gates shut. The city that Gwyndolin had thrown open was now closed tighter than it had ever been, even in the most isolated days of the old gods. No one came in, no one went out. The Boreal Valley existed in a bubble of controlled reality, where only the Pontiff's version of truth was allowed to exist. From beyond the barrier, the rest of the world watched Irithyll go silent. The Way of White saw one of its most important centers suddenly cut off from communication. Pilgrims were turned away by invisible forces. Messages went unanswered. Priests who had trained in Irithyll found themselves unable to return home. Many in distant lands came to see Sulyvahn's Irithyll as a place that had gone rogue, a faction of the faith that had abandoned the traditional teachings and sealed itself away to practice something darker. This perception would eventually contribute to a formal break in the church, a schism that divided the Way of White between those who still recognized Irithyll's authority and those who saw the pontiff as a usurper. But within the valley itself, such outside perspectives meant nothing. The citizens lived under literal and figurative chains, surrounded by moonlight and crackling flame, yet darkened by an oppression they could neither escape nor even fully comprehend. They were told they lived in a holy city, protected by their wise pontiff. They were told the barrier kept them safe from the dangers beyond. They were told that their home would always be in the Boreal Valley, and they had no way of knowing that every word was a lie. Sulyvahn could seal the Boreal Valley behind a magical barrier, but he could not stop word from spreading beyond its borders. And when news of his coup reached the other centers of the Way of White, the ancient faith began to tear itself apart. The Way of White had once been a unified religion stretching across many lands. It traced its authority back to Allfather Lloyd, the great uncle of Gwyn, and its teachings had guided countless souls toward the linking of the first flame. But now that unity was shattered, the church that had endured for ages found itself facing an impossible question. Was Sulyvahn the legitimate pontiff, or was he a usurper who had stolen power through treachery? High-ranking members of the Way of White who rejected Sulyvahn's authority refused to accept his rule. They could not in good conscience follow a man who had imprisoned the true gods and seized control through corruption. These dissenting clergy needed somewhere to go, somewhere beyond the reach of Sulyvahn's knights and his sealed valley. They found refuge in Karim. The Church of Karim was a major religious center far from the Boreal Valley. It had long been an important seat of the Way of White, home to its own traditions and powerful clergy. When the refugees from Irithyll arrived with their stories of Sulyvahn's betrayal, Karim made a decisive choice. It would not recognize the pontiff's authority. Karim effectively became the seat of a rival pope. The traditional Way of White continued there, keeping the old doctrines alive while denouncing Sulyvahn as an illegitimate usurper. Historical records confirm that this caused a partial schism in the faith. Suddenly, there were two competing heads of the church, each claiming to represent the true teachings of the gods. On one side stood Sulyvahn's Irithyll. The pontiff had embraced the profaned flame and woven Moonlit sorcery into his version of the faith. His church taught whatever doctrines served his power, twisting the old beliefs to justify his rule. The sacred traditions that had once honored Gwyn and the linking of fire were corrupted to serve a tyrant who answered to no god. On the other side stood Karim and its allies. They remained devoted to the traditional light of the first flame and the orthodox doctrines that had guided the Way of White for generations. They saw Sulyvahn not as a religious leader, but as a heretic who had perverted everything the church stood for. Many pious clerics, saints, and pilgrims fled Irithyll during the Purges and found their way to Karim. Some of them may have been notable figures whose presence lent weight to Karim's claim as the true center of the faith. The controversial Saint Rosaria, known for her connections to Karim, may have been among those who escaped Sulyvahn's reach. Each refugee carried stories of what the pontiff had done, adding fuel to the fire of condemnation building against him. The rift between these two factions ran deep. Siris of the Sunless Realms provides a glimpse into just how bitter this divide became. Her grandfather had been a faithful member of the old Way of White, someone who remembered what the church was supposed to be before Sulyvahn corrupted it. Siris herself refuses to set foot in Irithyll, except under specific circumstances. She will enter the city only to hunt what she calls Dark Moon traitors, those who she believes have betrayed the true faith. Her hatred for what Irithyll represents burns with personal intensity. Karim and its allies likely declared Sulyvahn's entire pontificate heretical. In their eyes, every decree he issued, every doctrine he taught, every ritual he performed was illegitimate. The barrier around Irithyll was not protection. It was quarantine around a diseased branch of the faith that needed to be cut off from the healthy body of the church. But Sulyvahn, wielding political savvy that matched his magical power, did not seem to care about condemnation from faraway lands. As long as he held power within his valley, what did it matter if priests in distant cities called him names? They could not reach him. They could not threaten him. Their words bounced harmlessly off the barrier that surrounded his domain. To counteract his diplomatic isolation, Sulyvahn leaned on other alliances. Most importantly, he maintained ties with the Kingdom of Lothric, a powerful realm that had its own complicated relationship with the linking of fire. As long as Lothric and other secular powers still treated with Irithyll, Sulyvahn retained a measure of legitimacy on the political stage, even as the religious establishment fractured around him. For common folk living outside the Boreal Valley, this schism created profound confusion. Two popes existed at the same time, each claiming to represent the true faith. Which one did you follow? Which teachings were correct? The unified church that had once provided clear answers to questions of faith and morality had splintered into competing factions that could not agree on even the most basic matters of authority. Within Irithyll itself, Sulyvahn handled this problem the way he handled all problems. He suppressed it. Any open worship of the Allfather of Karim or acknowledgement of Lloyd's traditional line of authority was treated as treason. Citizens who expressed sympathy for the rival faction risked disappearing into the dungeons. The schism was not something the people of Irithyll were allowed to know about in any meaningful way. They were told that Sulyvahn was the rightful pontiff, that his authority was absolute, and that anyone who claimed otherwise was an enemy of the city. This was the way of white civil war, though it never erupted into open conflict. No armies marched, no battles were fought. Instead, it was a war of influence and allegiance, fought through sermons and decrees and the quiet choices of individual believers deciding which faction deserved their loyalty. The outcome would not be decided by swords, but by which version of the faith survived long enough to claim the future. Aegon of Karim, a knight encountered later in this era, expressed openly what many on his side of the schism believed. His disdain for Sulyvahn dripped from his words and his bearing. To him, the pontiff was nothing more than a pretender, a villain who had stolen power and corrupted everything he touched. The hatred between Karim and Irithyll was not abstract theological disagreement. It was personal and bitter, and showed no signs of healing. In the end, Sulyvahn's rise to power had shattered the unity of the church completely. One segment became his corrupted regime in Irithyll, blending the profaned flame with whatever remained of Moonlit tradition. The other segment coalesced around Karim's cathedral, keeping the old teachings of Gwyn alive and waiting for the day when the usurper might finally fall. Two faiths now existed where one had stood before, and the rift between them would never truly close. While Karim condemned him and the traditional way of white declared him a heretic, Sulyvahn found a powerful friend in the east. The kingdom of Lothric would become his most important ally, and the pact between them would shape the fate of both realms. Lothric was a mighty kingdom ruled by King Oseros, home to the royal family whose bloodline had long been intertwined with the linking of fire. Prince Lothric, the heir to the throne, was destined to become a lord of Cinder and sacrifice himself to keep the first flame burning. This was the sacred duty that Lothric's rulers had upheld for generations. It made them central players in the cycle that kept the world from falling into darkness. Sulyvahn recognized the value of such an ally. Records confirm that even after his coup, even after seizing power through treachery and imprisoning the gods, Sulyvahn remained an ally of Lothric. This relationship granted him something that his sealed valley and corrupted church could not provide on their own: international legitimacy. The alliance was built on mutual exchange. Sulyvahn had access to resources that Lothric wanted, particularly the strange artifacts and forbidden knowledge buried in the ruins of the profaned capital. The kingdom to the east had scholars eager to study such things, and a military that could always use new weapons. Sulyvahn was happy to share what he had found beneath Irithyll's frozen soil. Most notably, the Pontiff donated gargoyles to Lothric. These animated stone demons had been unearthed from the profaned capital's ruins during Sulyvahn's excavations. They were ancient constructs of war, capable of flight and brutal violence. Rather than keeping them all for himself, Sulyvahn gifted them to Lothric as a gesture of goodwill and alliance. The gargoyles appear throughout Lothric's territory. Every time someone encounters one of those stone monsters in Lothric, they are looking at evidence of Sulyvahn's pact. In return, Lothric provided things that Irithyll needed. Knights and scholars from Lothric were permitted to enter the Boreal Valley, passing through the barrier with doles provided for that purpose. These visitors brought military expertise and academic knowledge that supplemented what Irithyll already possessed. A thief named Greyrat, who later traveled through these lands, remarked that he found artifacts of Lothric's designs scattered throughout Irithyll. The two kingdoms had become deeply intertwined, their resources and personnel flowing back and forth across the barrier. This pact was likely engineered before the great crisis that would define the era. Prince Lothric was expected to link the fire when his time came, just as his ancestors had done. But something changed. The prince refused. He renounced the sacred duty that had been placed upon him since birth and turned his back on the linking of the flame. When that happened, Lothric needed allies more than ever. The kingdom faced condemnation from the faithful who expected princes to fulfill their destinies. It needed friends who would not judge it for abandoning tradition. Sulyvahn's Irithyll was perfect for that role. After all, the Pontiff had already been declared a heretic by half the church. What did he care if Lothric broke with tradition too? The alliance solidified after Prince Lothric's refusal. Sulyvahn's Irithyll offered arcane knowledge from the profaned capital, perhaps including sorceries that Lothric's scholars could not find elsewhere. It also provided military assets. The Outrider Knights and other forces that served the Pontiff could be deployed to assist Lothric when needed. These shock troops gave Lothric access to warriors who fought with frost and fury, unlike anything the kingdom's own armies could produce. In exchange, Lothric provided political recognition that helped offset Karim's censure. The priests of Lothric may have offered clerical endorsement that countered the accusations of heresy coming from the rival faction. Having a major kingdom treat with Irithyll as a legitimate power meant that Sulyvahn was not completely isolated on the world stage. This explains something important about the politics of the era. Even as the Way of White split and Karim declared Sulyvahn's pontificate illegitimate, no concerted holy alliance ever attacked Irithyll. No crusade was launched to liberate the imprisoned gods or punish the usurper. Lothric's influence likely prevented such action. Any faction that wanted to move against Sulyvahn would have to contend with the powerful kingdom that stood as his ally. The two powers propped each other up in a world that was slowly falling apart. Lothric's own house was far from pure. King Osiros had dabbled in forbidden dragon research, attempting to transform himself into something other than human. The kingdom had its own heresies and dark secrets that made it a natural partner for Sulyvahn's corrupted regime. Neither side could afford to judge the other too harshly when both had abandoned the traditions they were supposed to uphold. Think of it as practical politics in the twilight of the Age of Fire. Sulyvahn's brutality was tolerated by some human kings because it kept a certain stability in place. Better to have a monster you could negotiate with than chaos you could not control. Lothric gained access to exotic powers and warriors that strengthened its position. Irithyll gained a shield against international condemnation. Everyone involved benefited, except for the people suffering under their rule. From Irithyll's perspective, this alliance emboldened Sulyvahn to continue his abuses without fear of outside intervention. As long as Lothric stood with him, he could do whatever he wanted within his sealed valley. The dungeons could grow deeper. The experiments could become darker. The chains could tighten around his citizens. No one was coming to save them. Together, Irithyll and Lothric stood as bastions of opposition to the traditionalists who had gathered around Karim. The spiritual and political landscape had been carved up between competing factions, and Sulyvahn had positioned himself on the side that controlled two of the most important centers of power in the world. This alliance would have consequences that reached far beyond the politics of the moment. When the bells eventually tolled to awaken the Lords of Cinder and summon them back to their thrones, when the crisis of the fading flame finally demanded action, Sulyvahn's forces were already positioned inside Lothric's borders. The Outrider knights he had sent as part of the alliance were stationed throughout the kingdom, ready to act on the Pontiff's commands. The pact that had begun as political convenience had evolved into something that gave Sulyvahn direct influence over the events unfolding in Lothric. The stage was being set for the final act of this story, and the alliance between the Pontiff and the kingdom would play a central role in everything that followed. The consequences of Prince Lothric's refusal to link the fire spread far beyond his own kingdom. As the first flame weakened without a new lord to sustain it, Lothric fell into disarray. The royal court scrambled for solutions. The people grew afraid, and the kingdom that had once stood as a pillar of the linking tradition now faced a crisis it could not solve alone. High Priestess Emma of Lothric made a desperate decision. She sent out messengers bearing the Lothric banner, calling on allied lands to provide aid in their time of need. The banner was a symbol of the kingdom's distress, a formal request for help that any ally would be expected to honor. Pontiff Sulyvahn saw an opportunity he could not ignore. Lothric was weakened and desperate. Its defenses were strained. Its leadership was fractured between those who supported the prince's decision and those who believed the fire must be linked regardless. This was the perfect moment to extend Irithyll's influence deep into the heart of another kingdom. Sulyvahn would answer the call for aid, but his version of help carried a far more sinister purpose than anyone in Lothric could have anticipated. The Pontiff had long maintained a program for dealing with warriors who might become problems. Knights who showed too much independence or whose loyalty seemed questionable were not executed openly. Instead, they were selected for a prestigious honor. They became Boreal Outrider Knights, tasked with venturing abroad on distant missions in service of Irithyll's interests. The honor was actually a death sentence. Before each Outrider Knight departed, Sulyvahn bestowed upon them one of his sinister creations, rings fashioned as black orbs that he called the Eyes of the Pontiff. These artifacts granted their wearers unnatural power in combat. One ring healed wounds with every successful strike. The other increased the ferocity of attacks until each blow landed with devastating force. For a warrior, these abilities seemed like blessings worth any cost. The cost was their humanity. Knights who wore these rings found their sight consumed by visions of endless battle. The orbs lured them into a trance of violence that never released its grip. Over time, the knights lost the ability to distinguish between vision and reality. Their minds deteriorated into nothing but the hunger for combat. Their armor began to fuse with their flesh as their bodies twisted into shapes that were no longer human. Eventually, each knight devolved into an icy beast that moved on all fours, driven by nothing except the instinct to fight and destroy. Sulyvahn designed the rings to produce exactly this outcome. By giving his Outriders these cursed artifacts, he ensured they would never return to challenge him. They would serve with fanatical aggression until the madness consumed them completely. And then they would continue serving as monsters, guarding whatever location they happened to occupy when their minds finally broke. It was loyalty enforced through destruction. When Lothric called for aid, Sulyvahn gathered a contingent of these doomed knights to answer. The commander of this force was Vort of the Boreal Valley. He had already begun his transformation by the time he received his orders. Frost clung to his armor, and his movements had grown heavy with the bestial power that was slowly overtaking his human form. Sulyvahn assigned him to guard Lothric's main gate, the bridge leading from the high wall into the interior kingdom. Vort would serve as an intimidating watchdog, preventing unwanted outside forces from reaching the castle, while ensuring that no one inside could easily escape. But Vort was not the most significant piece that Sulyvahn placed on the board. Among the knights sent to Lothric was a figure whose enslavement represented one of the Pontiff's most calculated cruelties. She had once been royalty, a distant daughter of the former royal family, carrying the divine blood of Gwyn himself through a lineage that stretched back to the goddess Guinevere. By birth, she should have commanded respect and deference throughout the lands that still remembered the old gods. Sulyvahn had taken her and made her dance. The title she carried told the story of her degradation, the dancer of the Boreal Valley. Before becoming an Outrider knight, she had been forced to perform as entertainment in the Pontiff's court, a princess reduced to a spectacle. Every step she danced was a message that no bloodline placed anyone beyond Sulyvahn's control. The humiliation was deliberate and complete. When her time as a dancer ended, the Pontiff gave her twin swords and made her one of his cursed Outriders. The blades he bestowed carried deep symbolic weight. One radiated the cold power of Dark Moon sorcery. The other burned with the profaned flame. Together, they exactly mirrored the weapons that Sulyvahn himself wielded. By fighting with copies of her master's arsenal, the dancer became a living emblem of his domination. Her strength existed only to serve his purposes. Her armor completed the transformation from person to property. A flowing veil covered her form. A jagged mask hid her face. Whatever identity she had possessed was erased and replaced with the hollow shell of a weapon wearing the ghost of a princess. Sulyvahn stationed the dancer in the cathedral of Lothric Castle itself. Her official role placed her as a guardian protecting High Priestess Emma and ensuring the security of Prince Lothric's line. She lingered in the shadows behind Emma, unseen by most of the world, waiting for the moment her master would call upon her. The truth was far darker than protection. The dancer was Sulyvahn's spy and executioner in waiting. If Lothric's leadership ever tried to break from the Pontiff's influence or seek alternative allies, she was positioned to intervene with lethal efficiency. The High Priestess she appeared to guard was actually being watched by one of the most dangerous creatures in Sulyvahn's arsenal. 3 other Outrider knights accompanied this deployment. They scattered through various parts of Lothric, infiltrating the outer town and the Grand Archives and other critical locations throughout the kingdom. 5 Irithyll knights in total now occupied positions across Lothric's defenses. The locals began to notice something wrong almost immediately. Wherever an Outrider knight went, an unnatural cold seemed to follow. Frost accumulated in corridors that should have been warm. The air grew bitter around the armored figures that patrolled their assigned areas. Whispers spread among the common folk about ghostly knights whose very presence brought an otherworldly chill that had nothing to do with the weather. But no one acted on these suspicions. The knights were officially allies sent to help during a crisis. Complaining about them would mean insulting a friendly power at the worst possible moment. So the people endured the cold and the unease, hoping the situation would pass and the strange visitors would eventually go home. They did not understand what Sulyvahn had accomplished. The Pontiff now had eyes and claws inside Lothric's defenses. His agents occupied positions that let them observe everything happening in the kingdom. If Lothric's royals ever considered seeking help from Karim or the traditional way of white, Sulyvahn would know immediately. If anyone tried to organize resistance against the alliance that bound the two kingdoms together, the Outriders were ready to interfere. This was an invasion disguised as assistance. Sulyvahn had inserted his forces into another realm without having to fight a single battle. Lothric had opened its gates and welcomed the very weapons that could be turned against it. By the time anyone realized the danger, it was already too late to remove the Pontiff's presence without sparking open conflict. The corruption of Irithyll had extended far beyond the borders of the Boreal Valley. The Ashen One arrived in Lothric with a single purpose: find the Lords of Cinder, return them to their thrones, link the fire once more. But standing between that champion and their destiny were the frozen sentinels that Sulyvahn had planted throughout the kingdom. Vort was the first to fall. By the time the Ashen One reached the base of Lothric's high wall, Vort had fully devolved into a beast. He charged forward on all fours, his massive frame shaking the ground with every stride. Frost billowed from his snarling mouth with each exhale, coating the arena in a layer of deadly cold. There was no negotiation, no hesitation. The creature that had been stationed at those gates existed only to destroy anything that tried to pass. The battle was ferocious. Vort swung his great mace with brutal force, creating shockwaves of ice that could freeze a warrior in place. His speed was terrifying for a creature of his size, lunging across the battlefield with predatory instinct that left no room for mistakes. But the Ashen One was determined. Blow by blow, the champion wore down the beast that blocked their path. When Vort finally collapsed, the frost that had surrounded him began to dissipate. One of Sulyvahn's primary outposts in Lothric had been removed. The gate that the Pontiff had sealed with a living monster now stood open, and the Ashen One could proceed into the city proper to continue their quest. The other Outrider knights scattered through Lothric met similar fates. In the dungeon beneath Lothric Castle, near the hidden garden where King Oseros had descended into madness, another Irithyllian knight prowled the dark corridors. The Ashen One found it and put it down. In the Grand Archives, where scholars had pursued forbidden knowledge until the very end, yet another Outrider roamed among the twisted crystal sage and wax-covered corpses. This knight too fell to the champion's blade. Every knight Sulyvahn had sent abroad ultimately met their end. They died not as mindless beasts forgotten in foreign lands, but as challenges overcome by someone stronger than Sulyvahn had anticipated. The dancer waited the longest. Hidden in the cathedral of Lothric Castle, she remained unseen while the Ashen One gathered the remains of the Lords of Cinder from across the kingdom. The champion fought through the undead settlement and the road of sacrifices. They ventured into the poisoned swamps of Farron Keep and the frozen depths of the catacombs. All the while, the dancer lingered in the shadows of that chapel, watching High Priestess Emma pray for deliverance that would never come. When Prince Lothric's abandonment of duty became untenable, when there was no choice left but to drag the reluctant lord back to his throne, Emma made her final move. She attempted to direct the Ashen One toward the higher reaches of the castle, where Prince Lothric and his brother had secluded themselves. That was when the dancer struck. She descended from the rooftop of the cathedral in a single fluid motion. Emma's body went limp as the silent killer completed her work with swift efficiency. The High Priestess who had called for aid, who had tried to save her kingdom by summoning heroes from across the land, became just another victim of Sulyvahn's reach. The dancer turned to face the Ashen One. There was no speech, no declaration of intent. She drew her twin swords and began to move. Her fighting style was unlike anything the Ashen One had faced before. She swayed like a spectre, her body bending and twisting in patterns that seemed to belong to a different kind of being entirely. Her blades spun through the air in spirals, trailing streaks of light that made her movements look almost beautiful despite the lethal intent behind them. The chapel became a battleground. The dancer swept across the floor in wide arcs, her reach extending far beyond what seemed possible. She leapt and spun with an otherworldly grace that made her movements difficult to predict. The Ashen One endured. Strike after strike, dodge after dodge, the champion fought back against the spectral warrior that had been waiting in those shadows for so long. The dancer's graceful movements became more desperate as her strength faded. When the final blow landed, the dancer collapsed in silence. There was no cry of pain, no last words from the princess who had been stripped of everything she once was. She fell, and the chapel grew quiet again. With the dancer's defeat, Sulyvahn's direct influence in Lothric came to an end. Every knight he had sent, every agent he had positioned, every frozen sentinel meant to enforce his will in that foreign kingdom was now gone. The invasion by invitation had been completely dismantled. The path to the higher reaches of Lothric Castle opened as well. A ladder dropped from above, granting the Ashen One access to areas that had been sealed off before. Prince Lothric himself waited somewhere in those towers, the final lord whose refusal had started this entire crisis. The Ashen One walked away from that chapel, having freed Lothric from Irithyll's grip. But they had also ended a tragedy that had begun years earlier, when Sulyvahn first decided to make a princess dance. The high wall of Lothric and the castle itself had become the grave of Sulyvahn's pawns. The spread of Irithyll's corruption had been halted by a blade and a will that refused to yield. With the frozen knights defeated, the path forward was clear. The Ashen One had dealt with Sulyvahn's agents in Lothric. Now the time was coming to face the source of that corruption directly. But first, there was another reckoning to consider. One of the lords of Cinder that the Ashen One sought had deep ties to Irithyll itself. Aldrich had awakened from his tomb and set his hungry gaze on the imprisoned deity that Sulyvahn still held captive. The siege of Irithyll was about to begin. The first flame had weakened to the point where an ancient ritual finally took effect. Bells that had remained silent for ages began to toll, their sound echoing across the world in ways that only the dead could hear. These bells of awakening called out to the Lords of Cinder, those mighty figures who had linked the fire in cycles past and been entombed until the flame needed them again. The bells summoned them back from whatever rest they had found. One of those lords was Aldrich. He awoke in a world ripe for the age of deep that he had dreamt about during his long dormancy. Having experienced the linking of fire once, Aldrich had no desire to do so again. He resolved to defy his duty of returning to his throne. Instead, he set his sights on making his dark vision come true sooner. Aldrich knew that the gods and their links to the first flame were the anchors keeping the Age of Fire alive. He concluded that to usher in the Deep Sea Age, he must devour the gods themselves and extinguish their influence. His soul's description chillingly notes that he knew the path would be arduous, but he had no fear. He would devour the gods himself. One god fixated Aldrich's attention above all others: Dark Sun Gwyndolin. Perhaps through some deep sensing that came with his connection to the abyss, perhaps through guidance from the deep itself, Aldrich learned that Gwyndolin was vulnerable. The god who had ruled Irithyll was weakened and imprisoned. Sulyvahn had shackled Gwyndolin in the cathedral of Anor Londo, keeping the Allfather as a hostage. To Aldrich, this was an opportunity beyond measure. Gwyndolin was an actual deity, the leader of the Dark Moon, a being with real divine power. Devouring such a god would strike at the very heart of the Age of Fire. It would be a gateway to ending everything the Old Order had built. Aldrich broke free of his tomb. The coffin that had held him in the Cathedral of the Deep was left behind, empty except for the residue of sludge that marked where his form had rested. The Saint of the Deep had risen, and nothing in that distant cathedral could contain him any longer. He gathered his most fervent followers for the march ahead. The deacons of the deep rallied to their Lord's banner. They would accompany him on this pilgrimage of destruction, casting the dark spells of the deep and bearing flames that burned with the same cold hunger that drove their master. Archdeacon MacDonald took a leading role in organizing this force. MacDonald had stayed behind in Irithyll during Aldrich's exile, secretly running the covenant of the Aldrich faithful within the very city that had banished their lord. He had kept the faith alive, recruiting new followers and waiting for the day when Aldrich would return. Now that day had come, and MacDonald emerged from the shadows to lead the assault on his home city. This was effectively a holy war of the deep. The force that marched toward Irithyll was not an army seeking conquest. It was a religious crusade aimed at ushering in a new age. The deacons believed in what Aldrich represented. They believed that the world was meant to be drowned in darkness, and that their master was the prophet who would make it happen. Every step toward Irithyll brought them closer to the fulfillment of prophecy. In their path stood Pontiff Sulyvahn and his frozen knights. The pontiff had tolerated Aldrich's exile because it kept the creature far from Irithyll. But Sulyvahn had also kept a leash on Aldrich by giving him the small doll that allowed passage through the barrier. That doll was meant to ensure control. Instead, it became the key that let Aldrich return. Sulyvahn had no intention of relinquishing the source of his power over the city and the faith. Gwyndolin, weakened and imprisoned though he was, remained a symbol that legitimized the pontiff's rule. If Aldrich devoured the Allfather, that legitimacy would vanish along with the god. Sulyvahn could not allow that to happen. The ordinary people of Irithyll found themselves caught between two terrible forces. On one side, the pontiff, who had oppressed them for years with curfews and dungeons and frozen nights. On the other, a bloated mass of consuming hunger that saw everything in its path as potential sustenance. Aldrich had no qualms about what his march would require. Anyone standing between him and Gwyndolin was another meal to be devoured on the way. The pontiff's knights, the frightened citizens, the very architecture of the city. None of it mattered compared to the goal that burned in what remained of Aldrich's mind. The siege of Irithyll was about to begin, and at its heart would be a battle between two forms of corruption: the tyrant who had seized power through manipulation and dark sorcery, and the saint who had transcended humanity entirely by consuming it. Neither cared about the innocent people caught between them. Neither would show mercy to those who stood in their way. The city of Moonlight was about to become a battleground, and the prize was nothing less than a god. When Aldrich's forces reached the Boreal Valley, Irithyll transformed into something it had never been before: a war zone. The city that had stood for generations under the light of the moon now shook with the sounds of war. Explosions of dark magic echoed between the towering spires. The clash of steel rang through streets that had known only the quiet footsteps of oppressed citizens and patrolling knights. Fire and frost and something far worse filled the air as two terrible powers collided in the heart of what had once been the god's own capital. Sulyvahn marshaled everything he had left. The pontiff knew what Aldrich wanted. He understood that if the Devourer reached Gwyndolin, everything he had built would crumble. The imprisoned god was the source of his control over Irithyll, and the faith that legitimized his rule. Losing Gwyndolin meant losing everything. So Sulyvahn fortified the path to Anor Londo and prepared his forces for a fight that would determine the fate of the city. On one side stood the disciplined ranks of Irithyll's military. Pontiff knights formed defensive lines across the plazas and bridges that led toward the old cathedral. Their frost-touched blades gleamed in the moonlight as they held positions they had been trained to defend. Fire witches took elevated positions on balconies and rooftops, their immolation tinders crackling with profane flame as they prepared to rain destruction on the approaching horde. Whatever enslaved giants remained in the city were pressed into service as living walls, their massive bodies blocking corridors that the deacons might try to use. Some accounts even mention drake-mounted knights joining the defense. These riders on winged beasts circled above the city, watching for breaches in the lines and swooping down to reinforce positions that seemed ready to fall. On the other side came the tide of the deep. Aldrich's deacons swarmed through the lower streets of Irithyll in their dark robes, casting spells that corrupted everything they touched. They moved with the fervor of true believers who knew their moment of triumph was at hand. Behind them came creatures summoned from the depths of the deep itself, spider-like beasts with too many limbs and mouths that opened in all the wrong places. Accursed things that existed only to devour and destroy. The two forces met in the streets and courtyards of Irithyll. The battle that followed was unlike anything the city had witnessed since the age when Gwyn first established his throne there. Pontiff knights charged into masses of robed deacons, cutting down fanatics who kept coming, regardless of losses. Fire witches unleashed waves of profane flame that incinerated entire groups of enemies, only to see more emerge from the darkness behind them. The deep's creatures tore into defensive formations with a savagery that even Sulyvahn's corrupted soldiers had never faced. The very sky seemed to darken as the fighting intensified. The murk of the deep rose up to contest the moonlight that had illuminated Irithyll for so long. Where once silver radiance had bathed the city in ethereal beauty, now shadows crawled across every surface, and the air grew thick with something that felt like drowning, even on dry land. Two banners flew over the chaos. Sulyvahn's symbol was the burning tree of the profaned flame, that emblem of the power he had discovered beneath the city and used to build his regime. It represented his ambition, his willingness to embrace forbidden fire, his claim to authority that superseded even the gods. Aldrich's symbol was the writhing dark sludge of the deep, that formless hunger that consumed all it touched and left nothing behind. It represented the end of everything, the coming age when fire and light and even the gods themselves would be swallowed up by an ocean of darkness. Neither side showed mercy. Neither side took prisoners. This was a war of annihilation between two forces that could not coexist. The common people of Irithyll found themselves trapped in a nightmare beyond anything they had experienced under Sulyvahn's tyranny. Those who could flee hid in cellars and sealed rooms, praying that the battle would pass them by. Those caught in the open had no such option. They became collateral damage in a conflict that neither side cared about them enough to avoid. For hours, the outcome remained uncertain. Sulyvahn's forces were formidable. His knights had been trained and corrupted to fight without fear or hesitation. His fire witches commanded power that could devastate entire formations of enemies. The defensive positions he had established were well chosen, forcing Aldrich's followers to advance through killing grounds where they could be cut down in waves. But Aldrich's assault had something that Sulyvahn's defenders lacked: an inexhaustible source of reinforcement. The Devourer himself was present on that battlefield, and wherever he moved, his power sustained the faithful who fought in his name. Deacons who should have fallen from their wounds kept fighting. Creatures of the deep that were struck down seemed to reform from the darkness and attack again. The zeal that drove Aldrich's followers made them willing to absorb losses that would have broken any normal army. Slowly, the tide turned against Sulyvahn. His knights began to fall faster than they could be replaced. His fire witches exhausted their power and were overwhelmed by enemies who kept coming. The giants that served as living walls were dragged down by swarms of deep creatures that crawled over their bodies and tore them apart from every direction at once. The defensive lines collapsed one after another. Sulyvahn watched his forces being decimated and understood that he was losing. Everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed and corrupted and destroyed to achieve, was being swept away by a monster he had once thought he could control by keeping it at a distance. The Pontiff made his stand near the steps of his own cathedral. When Aldrich's forces finally broke through the last defensive line, Sulyvahn confronted the Devourer directly. Whatever happened in that confrontation was witnessed by few who survived to tell of it. What we know is the result. Aldrich emerged victorious. It was a complete rout. The forces that had held Irithyll in an iron grip for so long were decimated in a single night of carnage. Sulyvahn himself was bested in combat, whether by Aldrich directly or by the overwhelming force of his followers. The Pontiff found himself wounded and facing certain death or capture. In that moment, whatever pride or ambition had driven him to this point gave way to survival instinct. He retreated. The Pontiff who had seized Irithyll through cunning and corruption fled from the battlefield, leaving behind the shattered remnants of his army and the city he had claimed as his own. His retreat cleared the way for Aldrich to proceed to Anor Londo unopposed. There was nothing left between the Devourer and his chosen meal. The fall of Irithyll's outer defense marked the end of Sulyvahn's dominion over Anor Londo. The regime that had oppressed the city, that had imprisoned gods and created dungeons and transformed knights into monsters, had been broken by something even worse than itself. Aldrich's goal was within reach. The grand cathedral where Gwyndolin lay, imprisoned, waited at the top of the city. The Dark Sun, who had once ruled this place as Allfather, would soon become sustenance for a creature that dreamed of drowning the entire world in darkness. The city of Moonlight had fallen to the deep. The path to Anor Londo lay open, with Sulyvahn's forces shattered and the Pontiff himself in retreat. Nothing stood between Aldrich and the prize he had marched across the world to claim. The Devourer ascended to the great cathedral at the top of Irithyll. This was the sanctum where the gods had once held court. The same halls where Gwyn had received the adulation of his knights. The same chamber where Ornstein and Smove had stood guard over a throne that represented divine authority over the entire world. Now those halls would witness something that would have been unthinkable in the age when the gods still ruled. In the former Dark Moon tomb beneath the cathedral, Gwyndolin waited. The Dark Sun had been imprisoned there since Sulyvahn's coup. Illness had weakened him long before the Pontiff's betrayal, and the sorcerous bonds that kept him captive had drained whatever strength remained. The god who had rebuilt Anor Londo as Irithyll, who had served as Allfather of the faith for generations, now lay helpless as something far worse than Sulyvahn approached his prison. Aldrich descended upon Gwyndolin and began to feed. The details of what followed are too horrible to describe in full. Aldrich's amorphous form engulfed the weakened deity and started the slow process of consumption that would continue for days or perhaps weeks. The Devourer did not destroy Gwyndolin. He absorbed him. Flesh and bone and divine essence all became part of the expanding mass that Aldrich had grown into over his centuries of endless hunger. By the time anyone would eventually reach this chamber, the process would be mostly complete. Only Gwyndolин's lower body and tentacled extremities would remain visible, still protruding from Aldrich's grotesque form, as if the god were being slowly pulled into a pit of black sludge. The rest of him would already be digested and integrated into the creature that now occupied the cathedral. The The consumption granted Aldrich more than simple sustenance. When a being like Aldrich devours something, he takes in everything that thing possessed. Gwyndolин's power flowed into the Devourer. Gwyndolин's soul merged with the churning darkness that comprised Aldrich's essence. Even the god's memories and abilities became accessible to the creature that had consumed him. Aldrich could now wield Gwyndolин's own attacks, moonlight arrows that the dark sun had used to punish sinners, the dark moon blade miracle that Gwyndolin had granted to his most faithful knights. Aldrich had not destroyed a god. He had stolen everything that God had been. Gwyndolин's death carried weight beyond the immediate horror of how it happened. The Dark Sun was the last true-born god of Anor Londo. With his passing, the bloodline of Gwyn that had ruled this city since the beginning of the Age of Fire finally came to an end. Only Yorshka remained, still imprisoned in her tower, still unaware of the full scope of the tragedy that had unfolded. She was the last vestige of that divine family, and she had been declared a half-breed by the standards of the old pantheon. The gods proper were now extinct. The age of divine rule in Anor Londo had been extinguished in the most gruesome way imaginable. The cathedral that had once housed the throne of the sun now served as the feeding ground for a creature that wanted to drown the entire world in darkness. For a time, the Deep's ascendancy seemed complete. The glorious moonlit cathedral of Anor Londo had become a nightmarish lair. Black sludge spread across floors that had once been covered in radiant blue carpets. The air hung thick with a fog of corruption that made breathing feel like drowning. Shadows clung to every surface, and the moonlight that had given the city its name could barely penetrate the murk that now filled the highest reaches of the cathedral. Aldrich settled into the center of the great chamber where Ornstein and Smo had once stood guard. His massive form occupied the space like a tumor growing in the heart of a holy place. Around him, the deacons who had accompanied his march stood in reverent circles, chanting prayers to the deep and guarding their lord as he slowly digested the god he had consumed. The imagery of that moment captures everything about what had happened to Irithyll. Once, a bright sun had shone through the oculi window of this cathedral, illuminating a throne where divine authority held sway over the world. That light had represented everything the Age of Fire stood for: hope, order, the triumph of the gods over the primordial darkness that had preceded their rise. Now only dark clouds and falling ash could be seen through that same window. The throne was empty except for the sludge that had spread across it. The devourer of gods rested in a chamber that stank of corruption and decay, and the Age of the Deep seemed ready to sweep away everything the old order had built. Sulyvahn refused to accept that he had lost. From his cathedral in the lower reaches of Irithyll, the wounded pontiff began working magic that would have horrified even his former allies. The battle with Aldrich had cost him nearly everything. His knights lay scattered across the city in pieces. His authority over the faith had evaporated the moment Gwyndolin began disappearing into Aldrich's gullet. The regime he had spent years constructing now existed only in the building where he had taken shelter. None of that mattered to Sulyvahn. He would hold Irithyll through whatever means remained available to him. The profaned flame still answered his call. That unfading fire had been the source of his rise, and now it would fuel his desperate attempt to maintain control. Sulyvahn turned that dark power toward a purpose he had never needed before. He began raising the dead. The rites of necromancy that Sulyvahn performed in his cathedral transformed the fallen pontiff knights into something new. The bodies of his slain soldiers stirred where they had fallen throughout the city. They rose from the blood-soaked stones and took up their weapons once more. Their armor still bore the damage from the battle that had ended their lives, but they no longer needed intact bodies to fight. The profaned flame's power animated them as spectral warriors. These ghostly knights became recognizable by the cold blue aura that emanated from their phantom forms. They glowed with an eerie light that made them visible even in the darkest corners of Irithyll's streets. Their movements were silent except for the scrape of their weapons and the whisper of ethereal wind that followed wherever they walked. They had no thoughts, no memories, no loyalty except what Sulyvahn's magic compelled them to feel. They existed only to patrol and to destroy anything that crossed their path. The phantom knights began appearing throughout Lower Irithyll. Travelers who later ventured into the city would report seeing these spirits roaming near the water fountain plaza in the heart of the residential district. Others encountered them on the bridges and staircases that connected the different levels of the frozen city. Wherever Sulyvahn needed defenders, his undead honor guard manifested to fill the role that living soldiers could no longer perform. This was the Pontiff's answer to losing his army. If his knights could fall in battle and rise again through necromancy, then Aldrich's victory meant nothing. Sulyvahn could maintain control of Irithyll's streets indefinitely, using forces that did not need food or rest or reinforcement from outside the sealed valley. The beasts that Sulyvahn had created through earlier experiments also received new orders. Those human-faced hounds that had prowled the fringes of the city were now actively directed to secure key access points. The creatures that had once served as terror weapons against escaping slaves became guardians of the routes that connected Irithyll to the outside world. Sulyvahn unleashed them with a specific purpose in mind. If Aldrich's followers thought they could come and go from the city as they pleased, they would learn otherwise. One beast took up position beneath the main bridge leading into Irithyll from the catacombs. This creature lurked in the dark water, waiting for anyone who tried to cross that span. Adventurers who later passed that way would find themselves ambushed by an alligator-like demon that exploded from the depths with terrifying speed. The beast had regained control over access to the city, ensuring that the approach to Irithyll remained guarded even with Sulyvahn's conventional forces destroyed. Another of these monsters prowled the flooded canals beneath the city, hunting through the waterways that connected different sections of Irithyll's underground. Anyone trying to move through those passages risked encountering a predator that combined the worst features of beast and man. The deacons who had accompanied Aldrich's march found themselves facing these creatures as they tried to establish control over the territory they had supposedly conquered. Archdeacon MacDonald had led the Aldrich faithful into Irithyll with the expectation that victory meant dominion. He had spent years building that covenant in secret within these very streets, waiting for the day when his master would return to claim the city. Now that day had arrived, and MacDonald discovered that claiming a city was far more difficult than conquering one. Sulyvahn's beasts hunted the remaining deacons through Irithyll's lower reaches. The robed faithful who had poured into the city as conquerors now found themselves prey. MacDonald fled from one of these creatures through the winding passages beneath the central district. He sought refuge in the water reserve, a hidden cave system that contained one of the old Dark Moon tombs. The beast followed him there. What happened in that watery cavern ended the Archdeacon's schemes permanently. MacDonald's corpse remained slumped against the stone walls of the reservoir, his robes soaked and his body bearing the marks of whatever creature had caught him. The man who had orchestrated the Aldrich faithful's activities within Irithyll died in the very city he had helped bring to ruin. His body would later serve as the focal point for those who wished to join the covenant he had founded, a grim monument to the price of the invasion. Irithyll entered a strange state of division after these events. At the top of the city, Aldrich occupied the cathedral of Anor Londo, slowly consuming the god he had come to devour. The deacons who had survived the beasts gathered around their master, chanting prayers and defending his grotesque form while he fed. They controlled the heights, but could not extend their reach into the streets below without facing Sulyvahn's countermeasures. In the lower city, the Pontiff held court over a kingdom of ghosts and monsters. His phantom knights patrolled routes that living people had abandoned. His beasts guarded entrances that no friendly force would ever use again. Sulyvahn himself remained in his grand hall, twin swords ready, waiting for the next challenger to appear. Between these two powers, the ordinary people of Irithyll had vanished entirely. Those who survived the battle had either fled, hidden themselves so thoroughly that they might as well have ceased to exist, or become casualties of the chaos that followed. The city that had once held a population of citizens, nobles, and clergy now contained only the servants of two terrible masters and the undead remnants of a regime that refused to die. The atmosphere of Irithyll during this period became something that later visitors would never forget. The streets were eerily quiet. No merchants called out their wares. No children played in the plazas. No worshippers gathered at the churches that had once served the Darkmoon faith. The only sounds were distant screams that echoed from somewhere far away. The clatter of phantom armor as spectral knights made their rounds, and the crackling of witchfire that still burned in braziers throughout the city. The moonlight that gave Irithyll its name still shone down on the frozen streets, but it illuminated a graveyard dressed up as a capital. Every corner might hide one of Sulyvahn's beasts. Every shadow might contain a phantom knight waiting to strike. The beauty that had made this place legendary now served only to make its desolation more complete. Sulyvahn expected this situation to be temporary. In his mind, he was not defeated. He was regrouping. While Aldrich gorged himself on divine flesh at the top of the city, the Pontiff would rebuild his forces in the lower reaches. The phantom knights would secure the streets. The beasts would prevent any escape or reinforcement. Eventually, Sulyvahn would be ready to strike back and reclaim everything he had lost. He waited in his cathedral for that moment to arrive. His swords rested in his hands, still stained from the battle with Aldrich. His will remained fixed on the goal that had driven him since he first discovered the profaned flame beneath Irithyll's foundations. He would rule this city. He would control the faith. He would achieve everything he had schemed and murdered to obtain. What Sulyvahn did not anticipate was that someone else entirely would be the next to challenge him. An unkindled champion was making their way across the lands of Lothric, gathering the cinders of lords who had abandoned their duty. That champion would eventually obtain the small doll needed to pass through the barrier around Irithyll. They would cross the bridge where Sulyvahn's beast waited in ambush. They would fight through streets haunted by phantom knights and lit only by witchfire. And at the end of that journey, they would find the Pontiff waiting in his grand hall, ready to unleash every ounce of power he still possessed. Neither Sulyvahn's phantoms nor Aldrich's deacons could stop what was coming. The champion who would arrive in Irithyll carried a purpose that superseded the schemes of usurpers and devourers alike. The fate of the first flame depended on returning the Lords of Cinder to their thrones, and nothing in the haunted streets of Irithyll would prevent that mission from being completed. The Ashen One came to Irithyll carrying a purpose that neither tyrant nor devourer could comprehend. This champion had already crossed lands filled with horrors. They had gathered cinders from lords who refused their duty. They had fought through the catacombs of Karthus and emerged into the frozen reaches of the Boreal Valley. Now, armed with the small doll that served as the only key through Sulyvahn's barrier, they stood at the threshold of the city that had become a battleground between two monsters. The magic seal parted before the doll's presence. Cold air rushed out from the passage beyond. The Ashen One stepped through and entered Irithyll's snowy streets for the first time. What greeted them was a city trapped between nightmares. Phantom knights emerged from the shadows to challenge the intruder. These spectral warriors attacked with the same disciplined aggression they had shown in life. their ethereal blades cutting through the frozen air. Fire witches hurled profane flames from elevated positions, trying to incinerate the champion who dared walk through their domain. Every step forward required another fight. Every plaza and stairway became a battlefield. The Ashen One pushed through all of it. They carved a path through Sulyvahn's undead honor guard, putting to rest spirits that had been denied peace by their master's necromancy. They dodged the flames of witches and struck them down one by one. The defenses that the Pontiff had erected to protect his last refuge crumbled before a warrior whose determination exceeded anything Sulyvahn had anticipated. Eventually, the Ashen One reached the grand church of the Pontiff. Inside that forsaken cathedral, beneath statues that wept with moisture from the cold, Pontiff Sulyvahn waited. His ceremonial robes still bore the damage from his battle with Aldrich. His face showed the marks of a man who had lost everything he schemed to obtain. But his hands gripped two greatswords, one blazing with profane fire and the other shimmering with moonlit sorcery. And his eyes held nothing but the intention to destroy whoever had come to challenge him. The duel that followed shook the foundations of the church. Sulyvahn attacked with the ferocity of someone who had nothing left to lose. His twin blades swept through wide arcs that could cleave an armored warrior in half. He leapt and spun with speed that seemed impossible for someone wielding such massive weapons. The profane fire from one sword left trails of burning agony, while the moonlight blade froze whatever it touched. Partway through the battle, Sulyvahn revealed one final trick. He conjured a phantom clone of himself, a spectral duplicate that fought with the same deadly skill as the original. The Ashen One suddenly faced two pontiffs attacking in coordinated patterns, their blades crossing and recrossing in lethal combinations. The champion endured. Strike by strike, they wore down Sulyvahn's defenses. The phantom clone eventually dissipated under sustained assault. The pontiff himself began to slow as wounds accumulated on his body. His swings grew desperate. His footwork faltered. Everything he had built, everything he had corrupted and destroyed to achieve, came down to this single fight in a cathedral that had become his prison. The final blow landed, and Pontiff Sulyvahn fell. His body crumpled onto the stones of the church he had claimed as his seat of power. The greatswords that had represented his dominion clattered beside him. The tyrant who had seized Irithyll through cunning and cruelty, who had imprisoned gods and created monsters and transformed knights into cursed beasts, breathed his last breath in the same building where he had performed the necromantic rites meant to save his regime. With Sulyvahn's death, the dark spell over Irithyll began to break. The Phantom Knights lost the animating force that kept them bound to this world. Their spectral forms flickered and faded, finally finding the rest that had been denied them. The internal corruption of the city had ended at its source, but the Ashen One's work in Irithyll was not complete. They ascended through the ruined passages that connected Irithyll to the old cathedral above. They crossed the rotating tower that had once served as a gateway for pilgrims seeking the gods. They traversed the broken bridge that led to Anor Londo's entrance. At the end of that journey waited the creature that had devoured a god. Aldrich occupied the center of the moonlit cathedral, still digesting the deity he had consumed. The Devourer's amorphous form pulsed with stolen power. Parts of Gwyndolin remained visible within that mass of sludge, a gruesome reminder of the god's fate. When the Ashen One entered the chamber, Aldrich turned what passed for his attention toward this new intruder and began to attack. The battle against the Devourer of Gods tested everything the Ashen One had learned. Aldrich wielded the combined power of the deep and the divine abilities he had stolen from Gwyndolin. The creature's body surged forward in waves of sludge that could engulf and consume anyone too slow to escape. Attacks came from every direction as Aldrich used powers that had never been meant to serve something so corrupt. The Ashen One fought through all of it. They dodged and evaded. They struck at Aldrich's form whenever an opening presented itself, hacking through the corrupted flesh that had absorbed a deity. The battle raged across the cathedral floor, leaving trails of dissipating sludge wherever the champion's weapons found their mark. Gradually, the Devourer began to weaken. Aldrich's attacks grew slower as more of his mass was destroyed. The stolen powers flickered and failed as the energy sustaining them drained away. The creature that had intended to devour every god in existence and usher in an age of drowning darkness found itself facing something it had not anticipated. A mortal warrior with the determination to stand against nightmares. The final strike shattered what remained of Aldrich's cohesion. The sludge that comprised the Devourer's body began to dissolve, evaporating into dark mist that dissipated in the cathedral's cold air. What emerged from that dissolution were the cinders of a lord, the substance needed to return this wayward soul to its proper throne. With Aldrich's defeat, the Deep's influence over Anor Londo began to recede. The cathedral fell silent for the first time since the Devourer had claimed it. The black sludge that had spread across the floors evaporated like morning frost under sunlight. The fog of corruption that had choked the air gradually thinned and dispersed. Through the oculi window above, moonlight once again shone down on the chamber, without the murk of the deep obscuring its radiance. The long night of Irithyll was finally ending. In her tower, Yorshka remained the last of Gwyn's kin in the city. She continued to preside over the blades of the Darkmoon Covenant, inviting new knights to take the oath and carry on the mission that Gwyndolin had established. The spirit of the Moonlit theocracy persisted through her efforts. Though the god who had founded it was gone, the ideals he had championed could still be defended. The Ashen One departed Anor Londo carrying Aldrich's cinders. Behind them, they left a city transformed by what they had accomplished. The tyrant who had seized power through betrayal lay dead in his cathedral. The Devourer who had consumed a god lay dissolved in the chamber of his feast. The forces that had torn Irithyll apart between them had both been eliminated by a single champion who sought nothing more than to complete their mission. Irithyll remained scarred from everything it had endured. The streets were empty of the people who had once filled them. The churches stood silent without worshippers. But it was free from the chains that Sulyvahn had wrapped around every aspect of its existence, free from the hunger that Aldrich had brought to devour its god. What remained was a quiet place where moonlight still fell on frozen stones, and the memory of old gods lingered in empty halls. The tale of Irithyll had come to its end. A city born from Gwyndolin's hope, corrupted by Sulyvahn's ambition, plunged into darkness by Aldrich's appetite, and finally liberated by a nameless champion who had kindled a light against the encroaching dark.